Welcome to our talk tonight. Glenn Fleishman has come out. We were lucky. He called up and said, I'm going to be in town. And we said, could you give us a talk and tell us about the Tiny Tech Museum? And he said, yes. And sorry it's so last minute, but thank you for coming out. If you have any questions about who we are the Grabhorn Institute, M&H Type, and Arion Press. We're fine press printers. We print limited edition books. We cast type in-house. We bind everything in-house. We do tours on Thursday at 3 o'clock. So come on down. It's a weird time, but please come. And we're starting to work out kind of a speaker series, and Glenn is now part of that. Yay! So keep an eye out. We have a new website that just launched Monday, so please check that out. And hope to see you again. And so now, Glenn, I'll just let you introduce yourself.
Thank you very much.
Right,
thank you. Well, hi, I'm Glenn Fleishman, as you can see there, and I used to call myself a recovering typesetter. I'd learned how to be a typesetter when I was in high school. On my high school paper used Phototype setting, which is now an obsolete technology in a very different way than letterpress is an obsolete technology. Nobody loves and remembers Phototype. A lot of people remember it. I should say that nobody loves it. You don't put pictures. You don't put pictures of Phototype machines on your wall, unfortunately, even if you will, of a letterpress. And so I used to call myself a recovering typesetter because I kind of missed those days. And I moved into graphic design and then journalism, and I've been mostly a journalist and a little bit of programming and a few other things for decades. And now I think I'm calling myself maybe as a recovering journalist because I used to make the jokes like I collect obsolete professions. First I was a typesetter, then I was a journalist. And I don't know, this buggy whip maker is already taken, I don't know. But what I've been a technology journalist for a while, and I've been more and more drawn to the past as a way to understand the present. And so I find myself, reading scans of books from the early 1800s, and I learn about things that, of course, people were already doing back then that we think are new 200 years later. And this project, the Tiny Tech Museum and Time Capsule, kind of grew out of this combination of interests. And the idea I had is that I did a little travel a couple of years ago and went to 3 type museums in a short period, or type and printing museums and archives in a short period of time. And I realized there's kind of this problem of how creative history is distributed. So there are thousands and thousands of museums you can go to in the U.S. and worldwide that have paintings, sculptures, works on paper, and other kinds of flat art and plastic art and 3D art that tell the history of creativity and culture across time. But you know what? And these places, I should say, these places are. There's a lot of them. They have a lot of work, not all in one place, but you can go to different institutions and see different things. You can also, they digitize the work. There are 3D walkthroughs, 3D renditions. Some places will give you a 3D model. You can print on a 3D printer of some of their work. So you have access to this incredible cross-section of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years of human creativity and culture. And I feel like history of communication does not have that same role. There are a handful of places around the world. Some are open during very limited hours, if they're even designed to be a museum in the first place. Some are facing constant financial pressures because people don't tend to fund these communication museums in the same way. I'm not sure if it's seen that they're less important, more so that they seem to have a trade or commercial focus behind them, even though they're about the museum in DC is a great example. It's an incredible institution. It never got the right funding model, and even though it's not about the history of printing and type or whatever, it's a communication history museum, and maybe they shouldn't have spent hundreds of millions of dollars building the building when the economy collapsed. But hey, anyway, it's a great example because its future is uncertain. It's going to have to sell its location, and that's maybe a really prominent example. But I feel like for all the artistic museums that are out there, graphic design will get attention in there, but kind of this craft, the practical part that helps drive forward communication, mass communication, literacy, the spread of ideas, gets shorter shrift. So that's kind of my, So there's definitely a danger, I think, that a lot of this is going to disappear, and it has already, because the history of printing is the history of obsolete technology. Because when you develop a new way to print things, you just throw the rest out. You throw it. Eric Spiekermann is a very well-known designer and typeface designer. He has a biography about him, and he talks about in the late 60s, literally printers were throwing type out the window, and he would go, in Kreuzberg, I think it was, and he would walk down the street and just pick up stuff from the trash, and he started letterpress printing in a really rough style, because he just grabbed the stuff people were throwing away. But that's the history of all printing, is stuff just gets tossed. So the danger is the physical part's going to disappear, so we could have stories and no objects. We could have, maybe there'll be a Colonial Williamsburg where they do printing kind of thing, but it won't be people doing real productive work. And so we have we're in a special place between M&H Type being the longest running type foundry in the country and producing at Rotary Press fine art books at limited editions and keeping the knowledge, tradition, and machinery going is incredible. But so I had this thought, which was, you can't get your hands on much of this. And I thought, I don't think I have the wherewithal, I don't have the money, let's say that kind of wherewithal, but I don't think I have the gumption to build a museum, at least not yet. So maybe we'll see someday. But I thought, what if there were a place you could hold kind of a synopsis of the history of type and printing in your hands? And I thought this might be a ridiculous idea, but it prompted discussion with my friend Anna, who is a woodworker, makes beautiful carved wooden spoons. She also was working until just a few months ago at a 2D laser cutting company, makes 2D laser cutters, a company called Glowforge in Seattle that was founded by a friend of mine. And it's an amazing, I'm not going to do a sales pitch on it, I sometimes sound like it because it's like the LaserWriter 2. It has that same impact of, it's about this big, and you put stuff in, and you tap on your screen, and suddenly a real thing comes out. It's fast. It's not slow like 3D printing. It's actually quite fast, especially cutting. And I brought some giveaways. I made some, like a kind of bizarre wooden replica of a piece of type history that everyone can walk away with on a Glowforge, so to prove this. But so Anna has this old new skill set, and we were just talking, is there a project we could do together? I'd love to be able to combine, and she's a letterpress printer also, and a doula, and she's like the most creative person I know. And we're like, what if I made a box? I made a tiny type box or something. She's like, well, I could give you advice. And then it grew and grew and grew into, what if you make a case, you make a beautiful handmade case that is just the right size to hold a few dozen artifacts, and I will start to do a Kickstarter to raise the money so that we can afford to build enough of the cases and collect the material. So some of the material will be, some of it will be made fresh for the museum using historic techniques. Some will be made fresh using modern techniques. Some will be historic stuff that I recover but that does not have a practical purpose anymore. So I'm not taking it out of the hands of current letterpress printers. So that's kind of the genesis of the project. But there's also, I thought about it as an experiential museum, and this will make sense in a second. Like, what am I looking at? If you don't know what it is, it's very obscure. I grew up in the Bay Area, and we used to go to the Exploratorium all the time. It's like one of my favorite places, and I've gone to other kinds of places as a kid and an adult. Whenever I went to the Exploratorium back when it was in Golden Gate Park, right?
Palace of Fine Arts.
Yeah, Palace of Fine Arts, right? Back in those days, before it has its new digs, which I've been to also. So I kind of thought about that as like a thing you can touch. I thought about kids' museums where they really want to make things available. So it has to be, at some level, not super precious stuff. It can't be irreplaceable, but it should be special enough that it tells you a story. I kept coming back to this idea of like, how do we preserve memory? And could this, that's the time capsule part, is could this little collection I'm making be a way to distribute knowledge across a swath of people who have an interest in preserving it over time? So not like everybody who knows about letterpress printing will disappear, or all the books will go away from Google Books and Internet Archive, but more like it's just a way to spread a little more thinly. And this, one of the things that inspired me is the Rosetta Project at the Long Now Foundation that's at Fisherman's Wharf. And the Rosetta Project is, they are trying to essentially, like, worst case scenario, society collapses everywhere and we forget a bunch of languages and how to read. And so they want to distribute, and they have distributed some, there's like a larger disc and a smaller thing that's almost like coin-sized that are printed with a special laser, micro-printing that requires a very low enlargement factor to read. And the larger one has, I think it's the Declaration of Human Rights, in a huge number of languages and some other text, and the smaller one has less information, but in a number of languages. The idea is the future could decode the past should an enormous amount of information be lost. And she was applying, Laura Welcher, the head of this project there, was applying a digital principle that was invented called LOCKSS, L-O-C-K-S-S. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. But it was designed for digital purposes. I think it's Sun, maybe they coined it. It was Sun. And I love this physical world thing. It's like, oh, lots of copies keep stuff safe. What if you disseminate, you sort of distribute a thin layer of material, then even if the worst happens or some information is lost, you have the key to understand. We could rebuild printing from scratch in hundreds of years. So that's kind of the idea. And what you're looking at here, by the way, so on the left is one of the Rosetta discs, and those glowing parts are actually the tiny type. And then this is an enlargement of the text that appears in different languages. And it's microscopic, but you don't need to grind a lens to view it, is my recollection. You can use some kind of standard optical properties. So the idea is in the future, if the lens grinding technology were to disappear entirely, you wouldn't be able to read it unaided, but you could tell there was text, and then someone could create something simple like a drop of water on a sheet, and you could look at it. So a very clever, way to decode it. So that's the idea. This is a prototype that we've moved on a bit. The handles will be different. I'll show you something in a second there. But there'll be a book, letterpress printed, set in hot metal, that'll be integral to the case. So the book will sort of decode the ingredients. It's going to cover 6 centuries of type and printing and explain the span of technological development. And then you'll open the middle drawer, will have flat things, and brought an example I'll show of one of the kinds of things. And the bottom will have individual pieces like wood type and linotype slugs and so forth. And so in this talk, I'm going to show you a number of examples of the kinds of things I'm collecting and give you a little background on them. So what's fun is, I got a little photographic thing so I can take neat pictures of stuff that looks good instead of being so in isolation. So I want the handles on this thing. This is just some brass knobs we had for the prototype, but I'm going to make tiny type handles for the Tiny Type Museum, probably 3D print them in metal, maybe in some other material. And there are people around the world who drive around and collect old type gear and sell it to current printers. And so there's several people in England. I've been in touch with a few of them. One of them is a fellow, Roger, who's, it's Urban Fox Letterpress is his business. They mostly sell on Instagram, and they're just driving around and knocking on people's doors and going to barns, and they're finding, wood type and metal type and presses and stuff, some of which are in terrible shape, some of which have been wrapped up and never used since they were made 50, 100, 150 years ago, and they put it up for sale. They're like, oh, there's some original Stevenson Blake, blah, 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 125 pounds postpaid. It's like, it is gone before I wake up in the morning. UK time, they've already sold it. So there's this crying demand in the UK for letterpress gear, and I saw he posted some handles one day, his drawers and drawers of handles, and I said, hey, can I get a sampling of them? So I bought a set of the Stevenson Blake and Hamilton and so forth to study to make these handles. And of course, I have some M&H type. This is just a sample that the fine folks here sent me, but I hope to include a part of a font of type. So this is actually probably more than I can include in the museum, but I thought it would be nice for people to have something, maybe they can't typeset in it, but some example of a set in a body size. So that's part of the plan. Also from the fine folks at M&H, these are burned out monotype mats, and so these are no longer useful for casting. They cast body sizes with them on equipment downstairs, these are incredible, and they come in various sizes because, of course, you needed a mold to cast metal type at every size. It's not malleable. You have to have every size for every metal size you want to cast. And so these are fairly tiny ones. Brian was showing me, we figured it was 4.5 point type molds, which is insane, but was the thing. They went up fairly large as well, like 48 point. I think there were some that were bigger. Did Monotype do bigger than 48?
Monotype is 36 is the max size.
But there's some, you can do 48 on different casters. And and Ludlow has larger size. I think I've got some Ludlow examples. So I'll include something like this as well, because it's great to see that range, like, again, different kinds of technology for different purposes. This is a larger, this is actually, I don't know which machine it's for. This is at the Type Archive in London. this is a digital type designer holding a piece, a mold for Albertus. And there's a long connection between Albertus and the type archive in London and Linotype. But I hope to include some molds. But again, my point is to not take anything out of production. So I'm trying to find material that has been scattered to the four winds, and collecting it wouldn't be useful except for historical purposes, but not so historically valuable that it should be in a museum to study and be available to researchers. And there's that's kind of a weird remit, but there's actually a big space for that. There's a lot of certain kinds of things that can't be used but aren't precious, and this is what I'm looking for in that space. I mean, here's an example too. I bought these at a Ways Goose at a printers gathering in Seattle a couple years ago. These are matrices for a Ludlow, where you'd put these all together and you could set a line of type but in larger type. So you set a big slug of metal, and this is a common. There's a bunch of those. You don't have Ludlows here. You have you have the Thomas. You said the Thompson. Yeah. So, but it's a very common thing. And there's a lot of these in operation because they're pretty simple machines, as I understand it, compared to other functions. They're just kind of putting lead into a form that you've built. You're not typing. You're not doing whatever. So it's a little bit of a combination of hand setting, whatever. So there's a lot of these, and these are no longer. The reason I have them is the person who had them, they were taken out of production. Because they were no longer of high enough quality to use to cast type for today. Then there's things like this. This is a linotype matrix, and I love it because it shows you, it's a bigger size than usual. It's kind of a larger body size. I think it's 18 point or something. And you can see the crevices there in the bottom. That is how, when you type away in a linotype, there's I think half the people here know this and half don't. So I'm going to describe it for those who don't. But it's the linotype had a big magazine on the top that was full of all these matrices. And as you type, they're released, and they would just fall into a row. And then you'd pull the lever, you'd rotate the dial, whatever it is, and you'd cast the line, and the matrices would go into be clamped together essentially, and lead would pour in. You'd get a slug would pop out, and you could set columns of type that way, just one after the other. It's an amazing breakthrough in the 1880s. So there's a bazillion, million, trillion old linotype matrices because they had to make them in the. I mean, I found some document from the linotype company from the 20s, I think, and they were boasting, we're making 20 million matrices a month in America alone or something. And so there's a billion of them out there, and most of them were probably thrown away, but not all of them are valuable. And there's a lot of linotypes still kicking around in operation in one form or another. But I think this is, it's such a beautiful piece of type history to see this. And those ridges on it, here's the great secret about the linotype. Yes, it was great to be able to type away and get a solid line of type you could use in newspapers primarily. When you're done, I forget, I haven't run the linotype myself, unfortunately. You pull a lever, you do something, it distributes the type, and all these molds would go up on an elevator up to the top, and they would, like a pachinko machine, they go and go into the right columns, and they would be resorted back based on those ridges on the bottom. So it was saved. One of the biggest parts of typesetting was distributing type, putting it back in the right place, and this eliminates it. The monotype system eliminated it by the fact that all the molds were in a frame. I don't think I have a picture of that, but you've got a bunch here. But we're in a die case, and they always remained in place and were pushed down to set the type. When you're done with monotype, they're like, just melt it down. Just use fresh type every time. But they solved the distribution problem in a different way. But in both cases, that was the worst part of being a typesetter, and you could it's still a terrible part of being a letterpress printer today, is distributing the type. It's like the unfun, I had some standing type in a galley, don't tell any of the printers here, for like a year and a half for a variety of reasons, and kind of just distributed it several months ago and made everybody happy finally. It's unforgivable. Unforgivable. Wow, there's a shop with not very much type. They're like, when are you going to come in? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. So I did it. This is the greatest thing ever invented, I think. Everybody here's a monitor. Does anybody know what these are? You know what they are, right? Anybody in the audience? Because this is a linotype thing. So these are spacebands. And the spaceband is an incredible invention because the thing that everybody wanted when the linotype was invented was, okay, we're going from hand set type to machine composed type. But you still want to justify columns. You want to flush left and right. So people have all these wacky schemes about, there are all these weird machines. You can find these hilarious descriptions in encyclopedias and so forth, all these devices that tried to solve the hand setting problem. Most of them used hand set type, like individual pieces, and tried to stick it together for you in some system. You turn dials and you pull things and push. But the big problem still was, how do you put even spacing between words so it comes out flush? And that was a big job of a typesetter. So these things, they're a wedge and they expand. So you're typesetting on the linotype and the molds are coming down one after the other, typing THE, and then you type a space and the space band goes in, you type blah, 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 blah. So what happens is, I should have put the picture, I didn't show it, there's a bunch of illustrations of this. So when it's time, you're finished with the line, you justify, and the space bands get pushed in, and every word space adjusts proportionally as a mechanical process. So all of them get wider as the wedge goes in, and then you have equalized spacing with no effort. And these are all reusable also. They get pulled back, and you don't have to distribute them. Monotype solved this differently by this hilarious, I won't even get into that. Well, I'll show you, this is part of how it solved it. On Monotype, when you type, you're punching out paper tape. And when you're done, you look at a wheel, you type numbers in, and then another system casts the type, and it would read the numbers first to know how much space to put in between and dial it in. It's clever. I'm getting that right. Did I get the detail? Okay, good. I'm a recovering typesetter. I have not used the monotype system, but it's a very different but very clever approach that solves the same problem. It's justified, flush left and right columns without the typesetter having to go through all these convolutions. It's awesome. So we talked about 2 days later cutter. This is a prototype also. The type case, this is the California case. So named probably because there used to be an uppercase and a lowercase. You had the uppercase letters and the uppercase, the lowercase, the majuscule letters and the minuscule letters. And so there's one theory is that the California job case was designed because people are going to California. You didn't have all the space. You couldn't have an upper and lowercase. We're going to put it all in one type case. And you can see out in the lobby, I think, do you have California cases? Drawers out there? Maybe not in the lobby.
I think those are older standard.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so there's a bunch, and there's like 3/4 cases, a bunch of styles. This is a very common layout, a very common case, and you can go to most current like letterpress studios, and you will find California case. And so I'm including it's 3-something feet wide by this, and I'm including a scale model so that people have a point of reference. So when you have the museum and you're reading about typesetting by hand, you have this to look at as well. Wood type is a whole fascinating kind of separate evolution history from metal type, and this is what this is why I love the project, because there's a million stories you can tell about every single thing. I bought a mixed lot of like what they call pied type. So pied type was you drop a bunch of type on the floor and it's all messed up and it becomes pie. I don't know. No one knows why it's called pie. Maybe it looked like old, broken pie. Nobody likes an apple pie on the floor. That's not a positive thing. But so I'm buying like mixed weird old type, and it's all incredibly dirty. And this is me after having cleaned it with some great instructions from a guy I know in Seattle, is a letterpress repairman. And some of this type has stamps on it, because wood type was made in more like industrial factory. Like metal type was made in foundries, which were industrial factories, I should say, but they were like metal shops. There were a million specialized machines. Wood type was made often near where there was wood, like in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, where the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum is. And so there weren't as many wood type manufacturers. At one time, there were dozens and dozens of metal type foundries in the U.S. They all had to combine because of the late 1800s. So that's a whole other story. But so I'm looking through all this type, I'm cleaning it up, and I'm looking for the stamp, because foundries would basically tap into the wood of metal manufacturer's mark, but not on all the type, just on some of it. And I think as time went on, I think they did less and less, from what I can tell. And I find a bunch of stamps in here. I didn't include the picture of the edge on. And of course, there's a wonderful guy who is deeply involved with the Hamilton Museum, who's David Shields, who has cataloged, among other things about wood type, all of the manufacturer's marks. There's a guy who wrote a book called Rob Roy, who wrote a book in the late 60s that David has republished, who did a partial cataloging, and more's been discovered since. So you can go to a page at David Shields' site, and here are the 35 or 26 known marks, and also the time at which they were used, because they changed out their maker stamps. So I'm like, well, I've got, this is a Thomas Page and Company, and it's, William Page and Company, and it looks like this. I'm like, oh, this piece of type had to be made between 1867 and 1876. So you can date stuff. And part of this provenance is what I'm bringing to the museum too, is that you'll know where I won't be able to identify where everything comes from, but in some cases, like even down to like a decade, like this was actually made in a factory, probably in Connecticut or in Wisconsin, and in this way. And wood type is being made of course, today, it's exciting. Laser cutting is a great way to make wood type because you can cut outlines or you can engrave down and put in the kind of detail that would have been impossible with the hand cut method where they used a pantograph, this mechanized thing that would trace a pattern and run a motor on the other end. You can make larger and smaller type. I've seen a couple different versions of this. I may have a photo coming up, if I can't remember. And I do have a photo coming up. You'll enjoy it. It'll make more sense in my explanation like this. But a laser cutter is an incredible tool to make wood type in a variety of ways. And so this is some of Scott Moore's more wood types work from the Hamilton get-together in 2017. And Scott's going to be making me some printer's fists like that. Probably exactly the one it's pointing to. He'll make 100 and some odd of those in 60 pairs like that. And some people will get a left one and some people will get a right one. But I want to make sure, like Scott is one of a handful of people who is really continuing to push for the modern manufacture of wood type and trying new techniques and keeping it fresh for current printers. I'm sorry, here is the pantographs. This is Georgie Brilski, who is, her mother was a longtime pantograph operator at the Hamilton Wood Factory and has, I believe, has passed away. She's passed away, is that right? No?
Norm?
No, I'm sorry. Who am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the wrong person. Right, I'm sorry. This is Norm's daughter. There was another woman who was a pantograph operator.
I think she passed away also.
That's all right. Anyway, sorry, they were all. It was the Hamilton. Yeah, they haven't been making wood type since the '80s, and so she learned to operate it, and she works at the museum as a volunteer, and does. And so this is again at the Hamilton Gathering, is showing how this complicated device. She's tracing on the right there, tracing the original pattern, and then it's cutting with a motor, and you have to use lots of different bits because you're doing coarse detail, finer and finer detail. Then it gets taken to another table where there are conservatively 500, it's probably 50 tools that you use to finish and chip out. And so this is what people did all day, is they'd be sitting there, incredible amount of expertise. Some people did this for 40 or 50 years to create the finished type. And there's a handful of people with this level of skill to remain in the world. In England, it was Robert de Little was the last child of the de Little family, which was kind of the main wood type, or one of the biggest wood type manufacturers in England. And until the 90s, when he was not that elderly, I think he's in his 60s or 70s, so I should talk. He was still making wood type in the old method. It was just him. He was like, the little factory was Bob. And he donated or sold all his equipment to the Type Archive, which has it, and then he's since passed away. But like that, these traditions are dying. And so having people who are apprenticing and know it and are teaching others, combined with laser cutting, is part of the preservation effort as well. These are just some little random bits of things. These are coins, Quoin, and coin keys, the things that look like hammers. And I kind of love this. There's all these aspects of printing that you don't know about until you go on press and you're working with the old stuff. And it's, I was just looking at a page of Gutenberg's Bible at the Letterform archive, which is also a great place and you should go to, and they have regular tours, and it's really cool. And they show the history of type and letter forms across the printing era mostly. And they get a page of Gutenberg's, or a couple pages of a Gutenberg Bible there. And I'm looking at it, and I've seen a lot of reproductions, and I've seen it behind glass where you can't really look at it. I'm looking at this page, and you're like, how did he do such a great job with his studio? He invented all the pieces you needed to print from scratch and adapted things and produces these beautiful books. But one of them is the tension under which you have to put type to keep it even and a good impression, because you're pushing down with force. These are the modern magic. Before this, you had pieces of wood and they'd hammer stuff in, and there was all kinds of nonsense to keep the type from moving when you printed, and so you get a solid impression, and it was straight up and down. You wanted a level surface that was perfectly perpendicular with the paper that's being pressed into it. So the coin, once you can make stuff out of metal consistently through a process, the coin starts to evolve into that. And the coin is a thing, it's an adjustable wedge, basically. It's the least sexy thing in the world. But the type has to be in this kind of tension. If it's too much, the pressure could force the type to pop up, and it would just spray everywhere. No good printer would ever do that. If it's too little, it moves around, and the type can get broken, or you get a smear impression. So this is this critical aspect that's like, it's like me talking about the oil in a crankcase. It's not that interesting at one level, but it's also, without this, everything would be harder. I've got people sending some fun stuff in. I've got people who've offered to donate things to the museum. This is a commercial project. I'm making some money off it, and I'm selling it and so forth. But people are like, what can I give you? And so Eric Spiekerman, who I mentioned earlier, he's like, I have some old type. I'll send you some type. So these are like postal indicias, like the postal stamp, a postal thing you put on business mailers. And Eric's like, I've got something. I'll send them to you. I'm like, all right, I'm accessioning them into the museum, and we'll see what's going on. This is another fascinating part. I like to challenge, or not challenge, but talk to current printers and historians about what this is. And here's another kind of better picture of what this is. This is a mostly forgotten part of printing history. These are called mats, short for matrix or matrices. And what they are is they're paper molds that were used to make printing plates. And starting in the year varies. People were starting to do this with plaster, maybe even in the 1600s. Some processes were developed better in the 1700s, but the idea is like you're setting type. Type is expensive. It takes a long time to typeset it. When it's in use, you can't do anything else with it. So what if you could duplicate it in some fashion and print from the duplicate? It's a great idea. Ultimately, the solution is, the one solution is type is hard and expensive and whatever. You have machines like linotypes and monotype casting and composition systems, so you can tap away and it's super fast. It's 10 times faster, 20 times faster to typeset. So that can solve one problem. The duplication problem isn't solved. There's a separate problem. I'm going too fast. I got this in a minute. I'll get into the rest of it. The separate problem is, how do you print faster? And if you're printing everything flat, you've got your type is flat, the paper gets put down, you slide the paper under a thing, you pull a lever, it pushes down, and you take the sheets out. It's very inefficient. What if you could run paper through really fast, like on a roll of paper, and the type was round? So this all goes together. I'm going to show you some more pictures in a second, but this is an exciting and forgotten part. These are like old movie ads, by the way. I don't know if you can't read from there. This is the courtship of Eddie's father, the movie, the Moon Spinners, House of the Damned, and these are ads that were sent out to newspapers, and they cut them into the full page of mats that was used, that had all the news stories to make their plates. And here's something, I don't think this is a stereotype, and that sounds like, I'll tell you the word means. A stereotype, you'd have mats on the one side, these paper molds, and when they were cast, the metal plate that was produced is called a stereotype, from the Latin hard copy, basically hard impression, stereos and typos. And so it's not, from the Greek rather, stereos and typos, not very hard coinage to come up with. So I thought this was a stereotype. I actually think it's just a plate, a different kind of metal plate that was created for printing on a smaller press. I need to get my hands on some stereotypes. They don't exist in large numbers. I've seen some because they were just lead. You just melted them down and used them, and then why would you keep a stereotype? As in so many things, there's a lot of this like, well, nobody cares about X because X is ephemera. It's going to get thrown away. It's going to get reused. And then it turns out to be historically invaluable, and we have none of it left. So this is my little, I already started the mats talk. The other word for mat is flan, from the French for flan. The English started calling it flan, and there's a great little story, which is stereotype. It originated as a printing term, and of course became a term in common use. Oh, you've stereotyped somebody. The word cliché, I was stumping Brian with the story, the word cliché, which we know as the analogy. Cliché is another word for stereotype for the metal plate. In France, they call them clichés because the sound of the plate hitting the press was cliché, 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 cliché. It's onomatopoeia. So both these terms, so you have typecasting, stereotyping, and cliché, all from this little area of type that all, apparently enough printers use these terms that enters general culture. So flan was like they called it something like flan because you put layers of blotting paper and tissue paper. Anybody know what blotting paper is? Tell the audience age here. No, one person. So it's a thicker kind of almost like a construction paper kids use. And so you put alternating layers of this or different stacking of it, and every shop had its own flan paste recipe, and the foreman would jealously guard this recipe against competitors. And you put this pasty whatever substance, and you put it onto something like this, a form of type. That's all locked up. You can see the coins all around there. It's great. You put it on there, and on a special flan table, you would beat it with your flan brush. your hard metal flong brush and you'd beat it all into the flong, into all the crevices so you get a good mold, and then you'd bake it, which could hurt the type and was a whole other deal. This is from a book about engraving from the 1920s, I think, that shows like this is on the left is a flat newspaper mat, so it's a full page of a paper. In the middle, cast as stereotype as a metal plate from that, so that you've got type, you create a mold from it, then you fill the mold with metal, and you raise it to type high so it'll go in a press. On the far right is a curved stereotype for newspaper presses, because newspaper presses are rotary. They spin, and they spin. You've seen a million photos or old footage of stop the presses and things are coming out in high volume. So newspaper typesetters are setting on these giant forms, and they have their own kind of flyers, a flong table, but they're also machines that would roll the matrix. So you put the thing in, and that's ultimately, you can find footage of this in like the New York Times I think it was as fast as 15 minutes from the composing room. You'd have an editor on one side. The editor is not allowed to touch the metal. This is against union rules. Editor on one side, the typesetters, the foreman on the other. They're locking up, say, the last front page of the paper for the night. The last story is going in. It's settled that this big metal form, this form, gets sent down by dumbwaiter or something to the stereotyping room. They beat the flong, they run it through the matrix machine, goes through, it comes out, they pull the thing off, they cast it in a special, that's the Guardian's press room from before they switched over. They cast it in the machine like the thing on the right that creates a rounded thing, so they're pouring metal in, they're putting this device in, whatever. They pull the plate out, they clean it up, and they said this book from 1940s I was reading about, they said it could be 15 minutes from it being finished in the composing room to a plate coming out. 15 minutes later, newspapers with that page would be on the trucks and halfway across town. And this is the days of metal and hands and linotype, but people still going in there at the last minute, pulling stuff out and fixing things up. Incredible. These are some shots from World War II, and this gentleman is, he's working, everybody's off at war, and so this guy was forced to work at the New York Times. It's probably forced under national rules. So they're loading a bunch of these half-cylinder stereotypes. So I had a question when I was researching this, and it was this. This is a real press. This looks like some kind of weird cyberpunk nightmare. There are 10 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all these different layers of this giant thing. This is an early cylinder press, and each of them is pushing in a piece of paper. As the type rotates around, it's a 10-man cylinder press. It's hilarious. So my question is, everyone's doing flat stuff, and suddenly they're going to round stuff. So type isn't meant to be like this. It'll go all over the place. And my question is, how did they make the transition? The transition was flong. Is once you can make a paper mold of the entire page and bend, basically wrap it around something and then cast it in metal, you can use it. But in the meantime, they did stuff like this. I want to read you something from a book called The Wonders of Modern Mechanism, 1904. On a big central cylinder were wedged the pages of type, secured by ingenious devices in turtles, which are like these wedges we kind of lock into place because the type is still totally straight, so you're kind of locking these wedges in, to prevent the letters from being flung out by the centrifugal force of rotation. With the best of them, some types were always sure to work out, marring the print. So this thing is spinning around and type is flying through. And then Encyclopedia Britannica in 1896, referring to a press a little bit earlier than this, made by David Napier, it said, Napier's press had a tendency to throw the type out, as did indeed all the presses up to this time. So they made round presses, but they didn't, they're throwing type out. I'm thinking as a typesetter or a printer, they're spinning this thing, it's probably steam powered, and these tiny metal projectiles are flying across the room. So you have to deal with boiling lead covering you and then tiny projectiles. So anyway, it was finally perfected. And perfecting means something different in printing. It was perfected in a different way. And by the Hoe press is one of the first rotary presses that actually was designed to work with stereotypes and continuous sheets of paper. So the continuously fed or continuous roll of paper was invented in the late 1700s in the Fournier machine. So it could create a seamless roll. And up until that time, all paper was basically created a sheet at a time. So you have continuous rolls of paper. They're just waiting there for 50 to 70 years for something that can feed them. And then suddenly you get stereotypes, you get rotary presses, you have these rolls of paper, and the acceleration of the production of newspapers goes up ridiculously. Like all of a sudden the volume goes up, they still are setting type very slowly, so they're not making larger editions necessarily, but you can, because these are molds, you can make multiple plates. So you have a press like this, you get 2 or 4 or 10 of them, or you hire out them, and you make multiple plates, and you're printing the same page of a newspaper on multiple presses. So suddenly your print run can go on, you can feed demand, the paper becomes cheaper, it goes from 2 cents to 1 cent. You see all these numbers across from the mid-1800s to the early 1920s, where the scope of everything just goes like this on this curve. And then in that mix, you add the linotype and primarily linotype in newspapers, suddenly giving same human power lets them set 10 to 20 times faster, and suddenly newspapers get longer. They print in bigger editions. There's an explosion of literacy. They start figuring out how to use wood pulp to make newsprint. A newspaper, cheap newspaper, all happens at once. So I have 2 embedded history lessons. That's one of them. The second one, so I had an ex-New York Times guy in the audience. These are both New York Times stories in part. But so the second one is something that came across in this process too. It's called Bogus Copy. And this is this union thing. It's the kind of thing that used to get rumored about, what was, that unions would have people just sitting around doing nothing. Well, so Bogus Copy is this funny little thing. And my dad sent me, after I wrote something about this, my dad sent me this. We used to have furniture stores in my family in Poughkeepsie, New York. Fleishman's Fine Furniture. My dad said, oh yeah, we used to get ad mats sent to the store, and then they'd send them to the newspaper, so they'd have a national brand, this is Hitchcock, and Hitchcock made these molds, and they'd send them for the right column widths, and they'd send them out to furniture stores across the country. The furniture store would take it to the local newspaper, and they'd drop in Fleishman, logo at the bottom, and reset some of the copy if necessary, whatever, put in the address. But here's the deal. Typesetters did not like outside copy being brought in, because typesetting was a heavily unionized profession and was from the 1800s. So once mats started to be a thing and flan started to be a thing, you started to have early ad agencies and so forth. Even in the late 1800s, you have people creating ads either on metal plates that are then they make flan from it and then they make a plate. It's a complicated thing, or you get flan sent in for something like this. So the typesetters say, this is great, that's just terrific, but any copy coming from outside the shop, outside the chapel, as they always use religious terms in letterpress printing, everything coming from outside the chapel, we're going to reset it by hand, and then we're going to throw it away. We're just going to distribute it. But every piece of copy from the outside, because they said, if we let a little of this happen, suddenly they're going to be typesetting entire pages, and suddenly they're going to set the entire newspaper from outside on flan and bring it in, and we're going to be out of a job. So this became known as bogus copy. And there's an earlier iteration of it I won't get into now because it's a little more complicated, but this kind of bogus copy went on for a long time until, from about 1871, one form of it, and until 1974. And this is from a New York Times story in 1974. There was a strike brewing. New York Times and other newspapers desperately wanted to get rid of the linotypes and switch to early computerized or computer-assisted typesetting. And some newspapers had started as early as the 1960s. But the unions in New York had a lot of control. They're called the Big Five. Big Five ran the roost, and they, that was the number of the unions, number 5, and they were even out of step with the rest of the international union. So New York Times is stymied, and there's a strike brewing, and nobody wants a repeat of the strike that happened in the 1960s. The papers were shut down. It was a disaster for everybody, including the unions. So bogus copy is one of the things. So they're still charging, they're still essentially having time on the clock for typesetters setting copy that's just thrown away. It's a linotype. So they'd set it, it would get proofread, and then it would get melted down. This is crazy. The Supreme Court actually upheld this bogus copy. There was a lawsuit in the 1950s, makes it the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says work is being performed. This is not feather bedding or having workers being paid for no work. They are doing work. Therefore, it is not a violation of the Sherman Act. There were other industries in which unions were actually having people just sit around, and those were illegal. So the typesetter had all the pressure, all the power on their side. So the New York Times negotiates this amazing deal. They break the logjam, the linotypes are thrown out. You can see a movie on YouTube called Farewell, Edwin Shirley, which is the key, Eta Owen Shirley, or the keys on a linotype, 2 rows of keys, most common letters in the English language, or English alphabet in text in English. the Times agrees to give lifetime employment to 1,785 printers and typesetters who were working in 1974 through the modernization and for as long as they work. And so they bought out a number of those people. They're already elderly, or they wanted to retire. They gave them good buyout packages. 200 people, I think, at that time were already over 65, is what the story said. The last person retired in 2016. He worked 50 years at the New York Times, the last person with this lifetime guarantee. He started as a fresh-faced kid. Rudy Socker, his name. He learned to set on a linotype. He learned all the jobs as an apprentice. He switched to computer-aided type, then Photoshop and InDesign at the end of his career. And I just love this great picture of his retirement. He's the guy in the red sweater there on the far right. And so he had an illustrious career and could never be fired, I suppose. Anyway, these are my two little type stories. And then back to the main event is, and so part of what I'm trying to collect too is that Phototype era I mentioned, era I mentioned, took place between this kind of end of metal type, and it was partly actually to help break the unions, partly a technological improvement. Is you're still the development of photographic-based or optical-based printing, where you could print onto using flat metal plates that had areas receptive to ink and areas that rejected ink, offset lithography. This was, by 1900, you start to see examples of this kind of printing. It starts to take off, and it's a photographic process, but you're still setting in lead, and sometimes they'd set in lead, they'd pull a proof, they'd shoot a picture of it, they'd expose a plate. It was ridiculous. So you need to pair with this photographic way of making flat plates that's much cheaper. The plates are incredibly thin. Everything about it is cheaper. You're not dealing with piles of lead, the whole thing. You need a photographic way to set type as well. And so Phototype was born. I think experiments started as early as the 1920s. By the 1960s, you have, I've got a set of 23 of these discs for the Verityper. These went into a machine that had a little photographic exposure unit for this kind of receptive paper, and you'd rotate this dial, you'd set some settings up there, you'd rotate the dial and you hit a button and it would expose a character and it would advance the variable width, so you had proportional spacing. All very exciting. You can see the depth of these different notches is different. Maybe we're onto the linotype matrix that corresponds to the proportional width of the character. So that was for setting kind of headlines, a little bit of copy, then become fancier and fancier. This is the machine, by the way. It's a little bit Rube Goldberg-y working, but your alternative was to go to a type shop and have them set it. This is a photographic thing. You just develop the film that comes out of the exposure unit. It's very straightforward. Monotype gets in the action. This is Monophoto, example at Type Archive, where they're using photo in a metal die case that's been changed. You're setting photographic Phototype. I've never seen it in action. Have you guys ever seen it? No, it's a really weird hybrid thing, very early. I don't know how much of this exists either, but it's one form of monophoto. And then this is the stuff that I learned to typeset on. These are strips. You'd strap two of them onto a drum. They each fit a half a cylinder. It'd spin super fast. You'd be typing at this huge monitor. It was this big. It was enormous. And you'd be coding in something. When HTML came around, I was like, already know HTML. I was using it on a CompuGraphic Edit Writer 7500 in 1986 because the coding language was very similar. What it was, and there's another language, it's called Cora. I forgot, someone was telling me about it just in the last couple of days. The Cora language, I think it was, evolved into SGML, which is partly how HTML was derived. So all the web coding, there's a relationship between that and phototype setting. But I got a hold of a bunch of these too. This is what the machine looked like at the left. That's the fancy CompuGraphic Edit Writer 7500. And I cannot find a picture that's better than that of the drum with the film strip wrapped around it. There's a laser in there, an exposure unit, paper. You'd set it. You'd sort of write the program by typing on your screen. Great 8-inch discs that would store stuff. You could store 100K on these 8-inch discs, floppy disks, and then it would essentially run the program and typeset a line at a time on this film. You'd develop the film, cut it out, wax it, paste it up. It's a great time. Frank Romano, who is an expert on Phototype and the linotype era, and is one of the founders of the Museum of Printing in Massachusetts, which I have unfortunately not gotten to yet in my travels. He gave a talk recently. This last May 11th. I was looking for pictures of Phototype. This is just some of the variety. You can see these are some of the CompuGraphics down there covered by the thing. These are just some of the different kinds of Phototype that existed. most of it is gone. Again, no one saved this stuff. Frank did, fortunately, or found it. And then moving like even a little farther in the future, this is Photopolymer. It gets used with letterpress. It was developed for the packaging industry for printing onto surfaces like plastic and other things for something called flexography. And it's this great hybrid, is you typeset digitally, you produce a high contrast film, it gets exposed to this material, which is light sensitive, get it developed, and the areas that are exposed, wait, I'm getting this right, the areas that are exposed harden, the other areas you wash it off, and then you have a plate that's raised, has raised material. You put it onto, with magnets or adhesive, that's backed with either, you put it onto a base and it raises it to the right height, and then you have something you can print on a letterpress, essentially digital typesetting directly into the printed page. And I used this to print a book in 2017. It was mostly photopolymer there was a lot of constraints about getting to that point. So it's a viable way to print. A lot of wedding invitations and certain kinds of copy that are done for commercial purposes are done in photopolymer because it's relatively affordable and it's not scarce. You make it as you need it, and there are service bureaus that make it. So you can smash that into the paper, you can crush it and get this deep impression, and you're not worried that you're harming your precious type that is no longer being made. This is a project that from Peeve 22, it's a digital type foundry in upstate New York that also has analog components, and the fellow who runs it, Rich Kegler, is a letterpress printer himself and teaches book arts. This is P22 blocks, and it's letterpress blocks that were made from a die. They're modular, so you can put them together in all kinds of arrangements. It's based on an old design from the early part of the 20th century, a modular metal type design. And but this is die injection molded, so digitally designed, produced and prototype, die injection molded, and it's just a tool in the arsenal for printers, for modern letterpress printers. This is a different example of 3D printing using just die injection molding is a conventional technique, so you have to make a prototype, make a die, mold, and then it's a process that makes every kind of plastic thing we have is die injection molded. This is directly 3D printed. This is from a press in London, the New North Press, and they had a whole set of letters designed and produced that they've done some interesting experiments with, and there's a lot of people looking into more 3D printing of type. 3D printing is expensive and slow and complicated, and the tolerances, unless you're using extremely expensive equipment, aren't tight enough for letterpress, because sometimes in letterpress you're looking at 1/1000th of an inch difference or 5/1000th of an inch difference between a good impression and a bad one. And it's funny, whenever I work with those numbers, I'm like, really, is it really like down to this? It's like the P under the 86th mattress. It's making my E stick up, and it's printing too heavily into the paper. And finally, this is just kind of a fun thing. I did a letterpress and laser cutting workshop at School of Visual Concepts, where I was doing a residency in 2017, and we decided to print chromatic type. So it's type that has different pieces you print in different colors, and they nest together to form a finished piece that looks like something like in the middle. And so we used a laser cutter to cut out. This type is released by P22, who I was just mentioning. It's called American Chromatic. It's designed from type, old wooden type that's at the Hamilton Museum. We printed these different sheets, so we used pressure printing. So you're sort of pulling pressure off as the thing is being printed, as opposed to putting pressure on and getting it inked. So we had 3 different plates. We did all kinds of work, and we produced that thing in the middle, kind of as a combined tribute to all the old and new digital and history. And there you go. So this is, I know I was kind of taking you through it's my backdoor trip through type history through the tiny type museum, but I'm trying to pull all this together in different forms. So I like talking about the type history more than the museum, because the museum is the outcome of this project. But well, thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it, Bill. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you guys for coming out.